Good evening. Good to see everybody. I don't know about you, but I had to swim in here tonight. A lot of rain. Make me a servant. Make me a servant, Lord, make me like you, for you are a servant. Make me one too. Make me a servant, do what you must do to make
Thank you, Paul. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for making it out here with the weather that we've got going on. So I appreciate you being here in person. And I know we probably have more people joining us online than normal because we've got storm warnings here in Nashville. So thank you for making it out here a couple of housekeeping items. I've been asked when this class is going to end. Not in a negative way. We just not sure. It's going to end next week. We will do chapter 16 next week. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to the summer series that we are going to be having that starts June the 5th. Timothy Agee is going to be here. I think everyone that's in this room knows him. If you don't know Timothy Agee, he's a fantastic teacher, and he's going to be here to kick us off. The theme is the servant heart, which is something that Nelson Whitfield thought would be a great theme for us to do, and we're going to be pursuing this theme for the upcoming year, the educational year starting in the fall. So be ready for this, but this will kick it off, the servant heart, that series. Also, I hope you got a handout on your way in. There's handouts in the auditorium here that are for tonight's lesson, and you can tell which ones they are because they have this really cool chart on the back. I didn't make this chart. This is adapted this from Chuck Swindoll. In the back of in the foyer on the bench, there are copies of all the lessons that I was able to save out there. If you're missing a lesson or if you just want copies for yourself, please take those. I don't need them. I will plan to bring those next week as well for anybody that wants them. And then I don't have any need for those. So take as many as you like. If you would like to, make a folder, hole punch it, stick it in a folder so you've got them for later, that's great. So that all said, we are up to Mark chapter 15. One other thing, I've got two commentaries that I hadn't mentioned before that I have been using for this series. This is James Edwards' Pillar Commentary. This is a fantastic series of commentaries. Currently, they don't have the New Testament completed, but these are really good. This is James Edwards. He wrote this in 2002, I think. And this is William Hendrickson. William Hendrickson wrote this in 1973. I've got his Gospels commentaries. He's very good as well. So anyways, that said, those are good commentaries. Again, commentary is an educated opinion. The Bible is its own best commentary. And we're going to see that tonight, especially when we get near the end of the lesson, because I'm going to be referencing the other Gospels as we talk about the material here. So, last week, we studied Mark chapter 14, and it began with the anointing of Jesus in Bethany by Mary. And between predictions of betrayal and denial, Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And we had that Markan sandwich we talked about. And while praying in Gethsemane, Jesus was betrayed. He was arrested, and then he was tried by Annas and Caiaphas, the former high priest and the reigning high priest. And then the chapter concluded with Peter denying Jesus 3 times. So that's where we were last week. So Jesus faced the Jewish authorities 3 times, and he also faced the Roman authorities 3 times. And we know this because we have 4 Gospels. If you just read Mark's Gospel, he compresses those encounters. Your handout contains additional details for these, and instead of giving a detailed report, Mark shows how Jesus fulfilled the final passion prediction. Now, this handout shows you the Jewish trials in blue, the Roman trials in red, and this has a very nice breakdown showing you where these occurred in the Gospels. So you can chart in the Gospels where they are, and I've got some notes as well related to those events here. This is all adapted from Charles Swindoll. I take no credit for this. Mark shows how Jesus fulfilled the final passion prediction, and the word passion is derived from the Latin word patior, which means to suffer, to bear, or to endure. And Mark shares 3 passion predictions, and we looked at these previously in these chapters. And each of these predictions has 3 common patterns, and these are the patterns. The Son of Man must suffer, be killed, and after 3 days be resurrected. And the Pillar Commentary, that's this one here. That's the James Edwards from his commentary. So that last prediction that he had, I've got up here, this is Mark chapter 10. The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." We're going to see the first 4 of these highlighted words we will see in this chapter tonight. And next week, Lord willing, if we're all here, we're going to talk about the resurrection in chapter 16. So, on Friday morning, the Sanhedrin convened to deliver Jesus to the Roman authorities. And we start out in verse 1 of chapter 15. "And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate." So Mark's Roman readers who would endure abuse at the hands of the Romans would have been especially interested in the conduct of Jesus during these trials. What does Mark have to report about his conduct? He received no special treatment, and he was treated unjustly throughout the entire process. If you look at this chart in the back here, in the center column, I have illegalities associated with each of these trials. And one of the things that you will see in all of these is physical abuse. There's physical abuse associated with virtually every one of these trials that's listed here. He receives no special treatment, and he's physically abused during the process. So verse 2, "And Pilate asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And he answered him, 'You have said so.'" Now, Pilate's question shows that he was provided with charges from the Sanhedrin. Either he was verbally told this is the charge, or he was given a written document. But this is his question: "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, the Sanhedrin changed their charges, right? Because what was the charge that they were going to kill Jesus for? Blasphemy. Remember that? He's before the high priest. He says, "You will see me coming in the clouds," referring to Daniel chapter 7, that Son of Man prophecy, and he is charged with blasphemy. But when they go to the Romans, you can't be killed for blasphemy, but you can be killed for claiming that you're the king. So, in the answer that Jesus gave, "You have said so," Chuck Swindoll sees an emphasis on the word "you." Others do as well. In effect, Jesus was turning the question on Pilate to consider the question that Jesus once asked Peter back in chapter 8, which was, "But who do you say I am?" You have said so. He's turning this back on Pilate for Pilate to think about what he has to say. Now, if you recall reading the Gospel of John in John chapter 19, 18 and 19, there is quite a bit of conversation between Jesus and Pilate. And so Pilate has to ponder some of this thing, and he says, "You have said so. But who do you say that I am?" And Edwards further clarifies this, and he translates the quote as "you say so," and explains that this was not an affirmation. If it was an affirmation, he would be immediately executed, right? And nor was it a denial of who he was, lest Jesus lie. But this is a suggestion that Pilate would do well to consider the question of who Jesus really is. Consider the identity of Jesus. So Jesus, in this encounter, we can see that Jesus loves Pilate. God does not want anyone to perish, but all to come to a knowledge of the truth. And so here we have this preserved. William Hendrickson points to John's account where Jesus told Pilate in what sense that he was a king. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And that's a charge which Pilate found no guilt. And that's recorded in John. Verse 3, "And the chief priests accused him of many things. Since the Romans could not crucify someone for blasphemy, the Jews framed Jesus as a political insurgent to secure his execution." Luke outlines some of the many things that they charged, and here we go. This is in Luke 23:2, "And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King. Misleading the people undermined public order. Withholding taxes encouraged civil disobedience, and claiming to be a king could incite rebellion. And what are the Romans interested in countries that they govern? They want order. As long as you behave and pay tribute, we're going to leave you alone. But this is the charge that they're bringing before the Romans. Verse 4 and 5, and Pilate asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. And Mark depicts Jesus as the suffering servant of God. That's a theme throughout Mark. And his silence is reflected in Isaiah's prophecy from Isaiah 53. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. I think this has a chiastic structure if somebody wants to evaluate that. Open not his mouth appears at the beginning and end. Anyways, Jesus doesn't say anything at this point. He's done having the conversation. So, commenting on Roman law, William Lane notes that rulers had the authority to acquit prisoners who were not condemned and to pardon those who were. They could also respond to public outcry by acquitting individual prisoners. The Apostle John specifies, "But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover." Now, at the Passover, this is symbolically appropriate and significant to free someone from bondage. Verse 6, "Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison, who he had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas." The rebels in prison would have included the two robbers who were crucified on either side of Jesus. And in prison with Barabbas, these men would have expected Barabbas to also be crucified. Now, the name Barabbas means son of the Father. Whenever you see Bar, that's son of. Barnabas, Bartimaeus, okay? Barabbas, and Abba is father, okay? So this means son of the Father. While speculation swirls about the significance of this name, Chuck Swindoll concludes that this is a generic name, possibly assumed to protect the family of this man who was accused. Today, this would be like adopting the name John Doe. Okay? Verse 8, "And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?' In Mark's fashion of using triads, he preserves the first of three questions from Pilate. Here are Pilate's three questions. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? What then shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And why? What evil has he done?" Look at those first two quotes. What's similar about them? He calls Jesus the King of the Jews. Calling Jesus the King of the Jews showed contempt toward the accusers of Jesus. Pilate was pragmatic and Pilate was ruthless. Pilate once incited protests when he used temple funds to build an aqueduct for Jerusalem. And to disperse the crowd, he sent soldiers into the crowd in secret and then launched a surprise attack. Jesus mentioned Pilate's cruelty to a group of Galatians in Luke 13, verses 1 and 2. Pilate despised the Jews and considered them a rebellious people. And Pilate was also shrewd, and he detected the treachery of the chief priests, for he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. The chief priests envied the popularity of Jesus because it threatened their influence. In all the Gospels, the word envy appears only once, and it's right here. James Edwards defines envy as, quote, grief or anger caused by another's success. Verse 11, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him released for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? By referring to Jesus as the man you call the King of the Jews, Pilate's second question both sought support from the crowd, and it also mocked the chief priests. Despite his efforts, the chief priests had already incited the crowd into a frenzy. Verse 13, and they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. Pilate's third question, why, what evil has he done, is preserved in Matthew and in Luke. And in Luke 23:14 through 15, Pilate declared that neither he nor Herod found Jesus guilty of any charges. So despite declaring Jesus innocent and scorning the chief priests, Pilate remained pragmatic. The Jews had threatened him with accusations of disloyalty towards Caesar. John writes this in his gospel. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So here is the motive for Pilate. He wants to keep his position. Now, Pilate had a sponsor in Rome who fell out of favor with Caesar and was executed. Not too far in the past before this event occurred. So he does not want to be on shaky ground with Caesar. Rather than risk a riot during Passover, which would have been a festival that the Romans deemed trivial, rather than risk a riot during the Passover, Pilate appeased the mob by delivering Jesus to be crucified. It's just one man. So Pilate, verse 15, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Now Mark, in my opinion, is one of the most brutal accounts that we have of the crucifixion of Christ because of its brevity. The Bible just says, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Flogging was a brutal prelude to crucifixion. Stripped and with hands tied above their head, a victim was whipped by a flagellum, which was a rod with leather thongs plated with bone or metal. And while the Jews limited lashes to 40-1, the Romans had no such limitation, and the person that would administer the flogging was a professional. He had a title. He could flog a man within an inch of his life. The lacerations broke the skin, tore muscle tissue, and could expose entrails. Josephus writes about this. Josephus was a general. He wasn't just a historian. He wrote about some of the floggings that he had administered under his authority. So this moves us over to where the soldiers mocked Jesus. Soldiers took Jesus to Herod's palace where about 600 men were called together. Verse 16, and the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. These soldiers fulfilled the prophecy that Jesus would be delivered to the Gentiles and mocked. Remember back in chapter 10, we had that verse up there. Verse 18, and they began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews! And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Here they're calling Jesus the King of the Jews. Pilate's already called him the King of the Jews twice. This is a repeated theme throughout this chapter. So this leads us to the crucifixion of Jesus. Crucifixion was invented in Persia. and adopted by Greece and eventually perfected by Rome. I say perfected because the Romans tried to draw out the death as long as possible. An upright stake was first driven into the ground, then a cross beam called the patibulum was attached to it. Scholars believe that the cross piece is what Jesus carried to the cross. This would have been a very heavy beam. He wasn't dragging an entire crucifix as is depicted in some art. This would have just been a single beam, which would have been very heavy. But weakened by the flogging that he endured, Jesus could not carry the crossbeam. Now, he's been up all night. He was arrested sometime around near midnight and then tried by the Jews 3 times. And then he appeared before Pilate. Then he appeared before Herod. Then he appeared before Pilate again. Verse 21, and they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. So Cyrene was a Greek city that's located in present-day Libya, which is in North Africa. They had a significant Jewish population. It's mentioned here and in Acts chapter 2, verse 10. Simon and his sons were likely known by the church because here Mark is giving a reference to these names. Rufus may be the same person that Paul greeted in Romans 16:13. So in 1941, a burial cave was discovered in the Kidron Valley, which is between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. And it contained an ossuary inscribed with the words, Alexander, son of Simon. Alexander, son of Simon. And while those were popular names, it's an intriguing find. Perhaps this is one of these men. Verse 22, and they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. Now, this is a picture of Gordon's Calvary, which it's a close-up. You can kind of see the eyes and the nose of the skull there. In 1883, General Charles Gordon identified a rocky slope that identified a skull, and this well-known tourist site is called Gordon's Calvary. However, evidence favors the site at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was outside Jerusalem's wall in the 1st century. But this is a striking rock formation. Verse 23, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Now, myrrh is an aromatic resin that's extracted from thorny shrubs that were native to the Mediterranean region, and it has long been used for medicinally and as a painkiller. So the offer of wine mixed with myrrh was an act of mercy intended to help him endure the pain. Jesus refused, choosing to endure crucifixion fully aware and conscious. Verse 24, and they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. So the Romans typically crucified victims naked. This was to shame the victim as much as possible. As a concession to the sensibilities of the Jews during Passover, the theologian Mark Strauss suggests that they may have left a loincloth on Jesus. And when you see him depicted in art, he typically has a loincloth. John, who was present at the foot of the cross, described the division of Jesus' clothing. This is in John 19, starting in verse 23. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be. Now remember, John's at the foot of the cross. He's an eyewitness. This was to fulfill the scripture which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. No gospel, and this is interesting, no gospel mentions nails at the crucifixion. You can look at all 4 accounts. There's no mention of nails at the crucifixion. But Thomas in John chapter 20 and verse 25 refused to believe until he could see, quote, the marks of the nails. This is why we know there were nails, because of this passage in John 20. Josephus wrote of Titus, crucifying thousands at the siege of Jerusalem, and venting their anger, the Roman soldiers nailed those they caught in different postures to the crosses. Verse 25, and it was the third hour when they crucified him. Now the third hour would have been 9 a.m. This marked the time when Jesus was crucified, 9 a.m. Before this hour, Jesus endured trials before Jewish and Roman authorities, beatings, mocking, and flogging. Verse 26, and the inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. Now, this is a quote from John 19. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. And if you recall, the Jews objected to the wording of this. They said, change it to he called himself the King of the Jews, and he says, I have written what I've written. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This is the third time in Mark that Pilate declared Jesus the King of the Jews. The written inscription was fastened to the cross above the head of Jesus, which suggests that the cross was a T-shaped crucifix like this. The other type of crucifix it could have would be they would put the patibulum directly on top of it, so it looked like a capital T. So this suggests it was the typical cross shape that we see on jewelry and depictions today. Mark 15, verse 27, with him they also crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. So the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Now this, in your handout, is in the New King James Version. All the other verses are English Standard Version, and the men, I'll tell you why in a minute. The men crucified beside Jesus were not common thieves. We call it the thief on the cross. This isn't what they were. According to Mark 15:7, these men were rebels who had committed murder in the insurrection. They would have been surprised to see Jesus between them rather than Barabbas. Modern scholars believe that verse 28 was a scribal insertion copied from Luke 23:37. It's not incorrect information, but they think it was a scribal insertion. This citation is from Isaiah 53, which predicts Jesus was numbered with transgressors. He bore the sins of many and intercedes for transgressors. So that explains that particular verse. Verse 29, and those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. So what is the definition of meekness? Meekness. And wait, there was a song, I think, Jesus Meek and Mild. Maybe I'm misquoting that. Anyways, you think of meekness as somebody who's just doesn't have any courage, right? That's not what meekness is. Meekness is power under control. Jesus could have saved himself. At his arrest, he told Peter that he could appeal to his Father to send 12 legions of angels. Remember that? And despite his authority, Jesus chose to demonstrate humility. And Paul records in Philippians chapter 2, verse 8, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So by staying on the cross, Jesus was delivering not himself, but the world from the bonds of sin. The irony escaped the chief priests and the scribes who made their last appearance here in Mark. Verse 31, so also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. So they're essentially wanting him to give them a sign, and a last sign. Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. Luke records that one of the robbers repented. Only Luke records this. And Jesus promised that man, today you will be with me in paradise. So speaking to one another, the religious leaders mocked Jesus. Unknowingly, These men fulfilled the parable of the wicked tenants which Jesus shared in the temple earlier that week. That was on Tuesday when he told that parable of the wicked tenants, and they objected. They realized that he was talking about them. In that parable, the tenants murdered the, quote, beloved son of the landowner, who, though rejected, this beloved son became the cornerstone of the church, the spiritual household of God. So we move on to the death of Jesus. I might run a little over. I'm trying not to, but I don't want to rush through this. When noon arrived, the 6th hour, supernatural darkness covered the land for 3 full hours. And the 9th plague, if you recall, the 9th plague from Exodus, darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. Verse 33, and when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So, of the 7 last sayings of Christ from the cross, Mark records just this one. He translated the Aramaic into Greek for his readers. His readers, remember, the first readers would have been Romans, Christians who lived in Rome, and they would not have known Aramaic necessarily. Matthew also records this line, but neither explains the meaning of these words. They don't tell you what does this actually mean. But the first line of Psalm 22 is this saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, if I was to say to you, amazing grace, how sweet the sound, how many of you could finish that verse in your head? Raise your hand. Okay. The Psalms were the songbooks of the Jews. And him saying that, they could totally complete Psalm 22. I invite you to study that sometime at home. Just pick that up and read it. And it's all about this event. He's telling them, I'm the prophesied one. I'm the one. And when Acts rolls around, in Acts chapter 2, many of those people who are converted were at the crucifixion. This might have had an impact on them, this particular saying. My God, why have you forsaken me? Verse 35, and some of the bystanders hearing it said, behold, he is calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. So some of the Jews who witnessed the crucifixion expected Elijah to return. Elijah, you'll recall, ascended into heaven in a whirlwind with a fiery chariot. He never died. And they expected him to return. That a bystander put a sponge on a reed tells us that Jesus was elevated above ground level. Crucifixions could occur where the victim was relatively close to the ground, but they required a reed to get this liquid to Jesus. Jesus took a final drink, cried out, and dismissed his spirit. He was finished. Verse 37, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So when Jesus died, the curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom, signifying that this was a divine act from God. If you were to go into a room with a tall curtain, you couldn't tear it from top to bottom. You're not tall enough. It's torn from top to bottom. Mark's text does not specify which curtain in the temple was torn. There was 2 curtains there. One was a public-facing curtain that hung before the court of Israel, and there was a private curtain that hung before the Holy of Holies. And scholars debate which curtain it is. And I'll talk a little bit about this for a moment here. Josephus described the former that hung before the court of Israel as being an embroidered Babylonian curtain that depicted the universe and the heavens in blue, scarlet, and purple. The curtain was visible to all the people. Josephus did not describe the curtain covering the Holy of Holies. If the torn curtain was this outer curtain, it additionally mirrors the tearing of the heavens in Mark 1 when God appeared at the baptism of Jesus. Remember in Mark 1 when the heavens were torn open? And I told you that this is a bookends. These are bookends in Mark. The heavens are torn. What does this symbolize? It represents that the dividing barrier between mankind and God has been removed. Christ removes this veil. Symbolically, tearing the Holy of Holies curtain would signify removal of the veil between God and humanity, and tearing the Court of Israel curtain could be an ominous public warning of the impending destruction of the temple, which occurred in 70 A.D. So we have conflicting views from various scholars on this, which I provided for you there. Lane remarks that earlier Jewish tradition speaks of an astonishing happening at the entrance to the sanctuary, not at the partition between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. So there you go. That's as much as I know about those curtains. Someone asked me last week, well, what did they do afterwards? Did somebody fix them? Did they replace them? And from what I read, I have no idea. So the centurion charged with managing prisoners during the crucifixion was called an exactor mortis. This was all completely new to me, and this is fascinating. Chuck Swindoll wrote about his duties. This is what he wrote. Remember, this is the man known as the exactor mortis. He had taken charge of Jesus after his scourging and final appearance before Pilate and the crowd. He had stripped the Savior naked, laid the patibulum on his shoulders, hung the titulus above his head, prodded him along the way of suffering, conscripted Simon the Cyrene to carry his burden, supervised the hammering of the nails and the erecting of the cross, witnessed the taunting of Jesus, and studied the Lord's response. When Jesus died, the man who had seen hundreds die by crucifixion exclaimed, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." It's not like he showed up at the cross moments before the death and declared this. He saw the treatment that Jesus was exposed to the entire time. And you may recall that the declarations of Jesus being the Son of God anchor Mark's narrative. They occur at his baptism, they occur at his transfiguration, and they occur at the foot of the cross, here at his crucifixion. So Jesus died on Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Chapter 15, verse 39. When the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So verse 40, there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joses, and Salome. I've got the three women highlighted here. Mark names several women who followed Jesus during his ministry. According to John, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was at the foot of the cross, and Jesus said to her, "Woman, behold your son." Verse 41 reads, when he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So in Luke 8, we read about the women who helped Jesus in his ministry. Luke 8, starting in verse 1, and the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, of whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. So they were contributing to the ministry of Christ while he was alive. I don't have much more, but we will go a bit over. I apologize. This is Mark's first mention of these faithful women. Mary Magdalene likely hailed from a fishing village on the western shore of Galilee. James the Younger and Joses must have been known by the early church. They're named here. Again, Mark is naming them. We know little about their mother Mary. And the third woman, Salome, was likely the mother of James and John and the wife of Zebedee. So this is the apostles' mother. So we're on to the burial of Jesus. Mosaic law dictated that the bodies of executed criminals, quote, shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. Verse 42, and when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. So crucifixion was designed to extend suffering, and men would hang on the cross for days. If they really wanted to extend their life, there was a seat that they could, a little triangular piece of wood that they would attach behind the upper leg where the man could rest himself. And the way crucifixion worked was essentially, you didn't die for blood loss. You didn't bleed to death on the cross. You didn't die because you were beat or flogged, or you could have died being flogged if they took it too far, but on the cross, you were asphyxiated. This is the manner of death that occurred. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Verse 44, Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. So he ordered the centurion who stood at the foot of the cross earlier to verify that Jesus was dead. This man has seen hundreds, if not thousands, of men crucified. He knows if somebody's dead. John tells us that the soldiers broke the legs of the men who were crucified beside Jesus. This hastened death by preventing them from exhaling. On the cross, a person needed to push up with their legs in order to exhale. So you could inhale all you want with your arms extended like that, but you could not exhale. So they had to push up with their legs to inhale, and then they would rest themselves again to exhale, or to push up to exhale and let down to inhale. So it was a terrible, brutal way to die. John also shares that the soldiers pierced the side of Jesus with a spear, releasing blood and water. John wrote that Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for the fear of the Jews. John also shared that Nicodemus, the Pharisee who came to Jesus by night, brought 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes to help Joseph prepare the body. Verse 46, and Joseph brought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in the tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. So according to Matthew and Luke, the tomb was new and unused. John added that it was near the site of the crucifixion. Remember, I told you, the Bible is its own best commentary. You don't have to look at other commentaries to get that information. Verse 47, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, saw where he was laid. So the women paid attention to where Jesus was buried, and in 2 days, which will be Sunday, they plan to return to anoint the body. So next week, please read Mark chapter 16. Now, this will be an interesting exercise for you. If you have multiple translations, I encourage you to take a look at how many verses you have from Mark 16 in your various translations. Depending on your translation, it's a short chapter. It could be 8 verses, it could be 20 verses, it could even be 21 verses. So we'll talk a little bit about that next week. Events in this chapter all occur on Resurrection Sunday. So thank you for staying over, and have a great week.